You don't need another content calendar or Canva template. What you do need is an identity shift. In this episode, I'm going to tell you how my content and my brand flatlined the more strategic I was trying to become, and how I nearly lost my identity through it by listening to multiple different coaches and trying to be as strategic as I possibly could have been, and how I actually got my brand back. Because chances are, if you've been in the industry for a while, in the digital coaching industry, you've been a coach for a while, or you've had different businesses that required you to build a personal brand, and at some point, you felt like there's some sort of disconnect. And you feel like you're showing up every single day, or at least consistently, however consistency looks like for you, and something just isn't sticking. Something doesn't feel quite right, but you can't pinpoint what it is. Yeah, that's exactly what happened to me for the last couple of years. Literally, I would wake up every day, I would do things, I would post content, I would post on Instagram, post on Facebook, post on Twitter at the time. And yeah, I was working with clients. I was running a social media freelance slash agency. But I was like, what am I doing this for every single day? Why am I showing up? Who am I creating content for? Sure, I was clear on my audience. I was clear on who I was working with. But there was just something about my personal brand that didn't feel like myself. So by the end of this episode, you'll know if your brand has that same content leak and how you can patch it. Here's the thing, it wasn't about the algorithm, because sometimes it actually is. Sometimes you show up on Facebook like it is these days, and the engagement and the reach are just not reaching. Things are not being the same. And I've literally talked to several of my clients, several of my friends, several of my peers, and they're like, yeah, it's literally the same for everybody. But this is not what we're talking about in this episode. We're talking about the identity erosion that happens to, I see a lot of coaches in the industry and a lot of personal brands when we try to listen to multiple different people. And your content may not be converting, not because you're lazy or you're not strategic. It's simply not converting and not hitting because you forget who you are. And that's literally what happened to me. Again, I was creating content, I was showing up, I was posting Instagram reels, and I remember the year 2021, you know what was happening back then, and I was posting reels, and I look back to them right now and I'm like, man, I was getting so many views. It was insane compared to today. But still, I was following the trends. I was doing those funny videos. I was not dancing because that's just ain't my thing. Like, you're not gonna catch me dancing on the reels, at least today. Like, some friends made me do it, but in general, you're not gonna find me do that because I feel like it's corny. Yeah, it's fun, and if it's for your brand, if that's who you are, that's cool. But that was one thing that I just refused to do because I was like, yes, it's fun, but that's not who I am. Like, people literally know me as somebody who doesn't really dance. Sure, I'll go out and I'll dance with my friends, with my girlfriends, whatever, but that's just not who I'm known as. And I'm pretty bad at dancing, in my opinion. But here's the thing. You need to remember who you are as a person. What are your personality traits? Who you are as a human? Who you are in real life? Because sometimes when we try to be too strategic, we're like, oh, I have to create content for conversions. I have to create content to build my brand and visibility. I have to create content to generate leads and all of those things. And then you're looking at it and you're like, who am I? Like, I don't hear myself. And something that I personally have done really, really well for years, actually, before I even started hiring coaches, although I did start hiring coaches pretty early on, but something that I did really well that a lot of people told me was the fact that when they read my content, my long written posts on Facebook, they literally could hear my accent. Like, they read it in my accent. And as you probably can tell, I still have a little bit of that left. So I used to have a pretty thick Russian accent and I wrote imperfectly, and grammar police would probably be after me, right? I did not have perfect grammar, even though I thought I did, but still I would write the way I would speak. And that was one of the best pieces of copywriting advice I've actually received that I want to ingrain in every single person: write the way you speak, because every single time you try to use ChatGPT for writing, especially if you haven't trained your ChatGPT, then we can tell. Like, I literally was just reviewing a client's email and we're doing a strategy session to go over the email and improve the copy. And I'm like, man, this, I can tell AI was used. Like, yeah, some of the copy is really decent. And I've even ran it through my own ChatGPT as well, with my own frameworks and with my own strategies. And my own ChatGPT was way better. And again, there was no shades to the client because I think she actually might listen to this episode. So hi if you do. But you either have to really train it well, and I know we're getting a little bit off topic here, but you have to remember how you speak in real life, what kind of words you're using. And something really interesting, just because I've been reading a lot of fiction books, a lot of romantasy, fantasy, a lot of smut. So for all my smut readers, message me on IG, let me know what you're reading. And I've been noticing some really exquisite vocabulary that I have never seen in my entire life. And that's when I can tell, I'm like, wow, this author definitely did not use ChatGPT to write this book, especially if the book is older than ChatGPT. I'm like, we know who you are, who's actually writing, because there are some writers that are lazy and that want to monetize as quickly as possible. And there are some books that you read and you're like, man, this really sounds like ChatGPT or like a 12-year-old has written it. And that's not a good sign, in my opinion. So for me personally, recently, I'm like, I really want to improve and increase my vocabulary. So I'm trying to make some notes when I'm reading books. And I'm like, oh, this is like such a cool word, because if I use that, people will know that it's definitely not ChatGPT. And every single time I see people actually use some really interesting words, because that makes me think, so you've actually put some thought and effort into that content, especially if it's a non-native speaker. I'm like, you're really putting some effort. And I love my non-native speakers because it takes some real effort for us to write. Now, speaking of frameworks and coaches that you probably have been working with, you've been following different frameworks, you've been following different methodologies and strategies for writing content, for running your business. And it's great. Like, it's okay to work with multiple different people. I've done it several times. Personally, right now where I'm at in business, I prefer to work with one, maybe two people at the same time. I've literally unsubscribed from majority of the email list that I've been subscribed to, because I just don't want a lot of that noise. I don't want to be getting confused and torn in multiple different directions. Even though, as somebody who's been in the industry for 10 years, I rarely get overwhelmed by the advice, and I know how to kind of compartmentalize that information inside of my brain. But even still, sometimes you are trying to kind of Frankenstein your brand and your content strategy. You're trying to take one piece from one coach, another piece from another coach, but even though that can work, and I've actually done it the same way. Literally, the strategy that I used in the very beginning when I was 19 years old, 19, 20, when I didn't have pretty much any money to invest in coaches, even like little programs. The very first course that I bought was $297 that I used all the profits I made in my business, or like the revenue that I made. And I just dumped it into that course, and it was about the blogging and content creation. So I still feel like it was one of the best investments. So prior to that first investment, I literally followed a couple of people who some people recommended to me. They said, follow this coach, this mentor, this person in network marketing. And I was like, okay, cool. And I literally followed their email list. I followed what they were doing on social media. I followed what they were selling. I was essentially trying to reverse engineer everything they were doing. And that's what worked originally. I was like, okay, so they have this kind of website, they have these kinds of funnels, what kind of headlines they were using, what kind of buttons they had. So I've literally just did studying what other successful people were doing, because I was like, I know there's so much more that they're doing, but I had to at least see the surface level stuff, because of course, you don't see everything that's happening in people's businesses. You don't see all the testing, you don't see all the ads. And that's actually something that I would recommend for you if you are in the very beginning of your business. If you're somebody like me, maybe you're listening and maybe you're in your 20s, maybe you're just getting started. If you don't have a lot of budget in the beginning, that is literally what I would do. You could even go into Facebook and go into ad library and study what other people's ads are looking like. And especially, I would recommend studying the ads that have been running for a while, because if you go to the ad library, you can see when those ads have been launched. And I like to see the business owners who have been running their ads for at least 3 months, because if that ad is running for at least 3 months, Or even better, even if it's been running for 6 months, you know that this kind of ad is working, because I have stalked a lot of business owners' ads, and I've seen a lot of them turn on their ads and then turn them off the next month. And I'm like, okay, that stuff is not working. That gives me some information about what is happening in the industry and what gets attention and what doesn't. And you will even notice if you scroll through your Facebook, if you get any ads by potential coaches that you might want to work with, you will see that some of them start to reappear month in, month out. There's one woman who I follow who teaches advertising, specifically Facebook ads, meta ads, let's just put it that way. And I'm in her membership. I've been in her membership for years now. And her ads I do see very frequently, even the ads promoting that same membership. And I'm like, okay, so it's been about 2 years that she's had that ad running. Clearly, this is bringing her clients. So that is something that I can look at and then emulate in my business. Not copy, not copycat, plagiarize. That's not what we do here, but I can mimic a little bit of it. But now there also comes a point where you have to know who you are and know how you speak, what things you want to do in business and what not. Because every single time I would learn from different mentors, I would notice certain strategies that they were doing. For example, in the very beginning, I was not comfortable with YouTube. And I was like, okay, so I need to hone in on my strengths. I need to focus on what I'm already good at, and then the rest I can just put in the back. And in the beginning, I was just learning how to write. So I started with Facebook, I started with blogging, I was writing before I got comfortable a little bit on camera. Then I was like, okay, let me get to YouTube and start creating videos until I got better at it, that I now can show up without a specific script. I do have some bullet points that I'm talking through because obviously this has to be prepared. In my opinion, I used to literally run Facebook Lives just on the fly. And while it can work, I do believe in preparation. So whether you are skilled at video or not, I feel like every single person needs to have a prepared plan. And a lot of the times when your content feels off, it probably is, because what I see happen with a lot of coaches is they listen to the coach and then all of a sudden they start sounding like their coach. For example, if you're learning psychology and then you've never really taught that before, then all of a sudden you see those coaches start teaching psychology. And I'm just saying this as kind of my own example right now because I'm learning a lot of the psychological principles from my coach, but I know for a fact that for me, that is not something I'm really good at teaching, at least publicly or at least right now. And I've seen some coaches literally do that. Like they would go learn from somebody and then they start teaching the same thing they learned. And it works for a while, but you still have to figure out what is your thing. For me, it's always been content creation. I know some psychological principles have to be applied in order for the content to be more effective, but I just personally teach it from a different angle and from a different perspective. And sometimes maybe squeezing in a little like psychological tactic or like why this works or why this doesn't work. But you have to really know what your voice is other than just regurgitating information from your coach. And the same thing applies when you get any kind of bundles or templates from viral hooks. It's really noticeable when people start using those because, yes, hooks are important in video content. Yes, they have a place to be and you have to always work on them, but you also have to make them work for yourself because there are certain things that I would never say myself on video or I would never use in my hooks. I'm not a huge fan of making massive claims. I'm not a huge fan of promising or over-promising things in the content because I know that can be a red flag. So you'll never see me do that personally. Or even if I ever do that, that can only be thrown as a joke. So be very careful when you are using hooks because, again, I'm not against buying templates. I'm not against any of that. But don't try to template your way to a successful business. And something that I personally don't believe in is finding your voice, maybe like in a sense of remembering who the hell you are, because that's the most important piece, is when you work with different coaches, they have to bring out who you are, not just like, oh, I'll teach you this strategy and then you implement however the hell you want. No, you have to remember who you are, what you wear before you hire that coach, what you are as a person, like what's your personality like, what are your core values, what are some things that you can share online that are going to make people trust you, make people really sometimes even relate. I'm not a huge fan of this word these days because not everything you share has to be relatable, but it has to position you as an authority and help people have that trust with you. For example, recently I shared a villain story of myself online, which was not really a villain story, but it was about me being pissed at my teacher and being kind of pissed at my best friend as well because she got a higher grade at school than I did in Hebrew. And it kind of made me a villain because I nearly cursed out my teacher, and that's very out of character for myself, even though I can be quite harsh. But being harsh at the age of 17, 18, that was like, what the F? But that really had an amazing response from my audience. They were like, man, I love that story. And even my coach was like, this is the most Angelina story that I've ever heard, even though it's positioned as a villain, but it's kind of not a villain. But those kinds of stories are going to make you memorable. What are some personality traits that you have that are going to make you stand out from everybody else? Because if we were to put it very simply, the only thing that's really going to make you different from everybody else is who you are, is your story, your background, you are as a person, because we are all very different people. And sure, there can be people who are similar, and there is going to be a million different people who teach the same thing that you teach, but there's not ever going to be a single person who teaches that thing the same way that you do and brings the same heart that you do to that specific line of work. Now, I want to leave you with a couple of actionable steps that you can do after you listen to this podcast or this video. First of all, I want you to audit your content and figure out what is yours and what sounds like mimicry, what doesn't really sound like yourself. Because sometimes, again, like I said, we listen to trainings, we listen to webinars, we listen to coaches, and then we adjust our messaging based on what they say. And even though a lot of the times it is good advice, a lot of the times is kind of the key, not the key. And I want you to also, when you're writing content, take your notes app, whether you're on iPhone or Android phone, or you can even use like the voice memo, wherever you want to use on your phone, and use the audio feature to record your voice and then have it be transcribed into the text. And then from then, you can also tweak how you write the content. This is actually sometimes what I've done when I have this idea and I'm like, I really want to write it down, but it doesn't come out properly. So I'm like, okay, let me just pull out my phone and record an audio. And then I use the transcription. Sometimes I run it through ChatGPT just to kind of see what it's going to spit out. Other times I write it myself and write my own hook, my own everything. And I would recommend doing that because, again, going back to the piece of advice where I said that write your content the way you speak, this is really going to help you out. The other thing that I want you to do, number two, reconnect with your origin story and positioning. Something that I do actually, go back through your phone gallery. If you don't remember who the hell you are, I would want you to go through your phone gallery. And for me, it always brings out the memories from the past. And then I'm like, oh, I've done this, I've achieved this, I spoke on this stage, I got this award, I've got that. So sometimes I would even go through my Facebook albums or the memories, and I'm like, oh, I didn't even realize I've done that, because again, we don't give ourselves enough credit for the things that we have accomplished. And we sometimes don't remember who we are and what our personality is and what we've done. Especially when I was writing my villain story, I was really thinking back to the messed up things that I've done that were kind of justified. And I was like, wow, I am actually a pretty good person. I haven't had a lot of the villain moments. So I want you to reconnect with your origin story and your positioning. And another thing that I want you to also start creating pattern breaker posts that only you could write. So think of any, again, stories. Stories is something that ChatGPT is not going to write for you. And stories is something that's really going to separate you from everybody else, because the biggest challenge right now with content, and this is something that's going to keep happening and happening over the next several years, all of the content is going to be generated by ChatGPT. I believe it was even predicted by 2026, 99% of content is going to be AI written, generated, because these days you can even create an avatar of yourself that's going to look exactly like you. Not something that I practice at the moment, but I've seen some very realistic ones and it's a little bit scary. In my opinion, the way you double down on that, the way you're going to stand out from all the AI written content is one, remembering who you are and your origin story, remembering the stories from the past and like everything that's been happening to you, and also sharing more of that. And then also, of course, getting on video. And sure, you can create those AI avatars and you can experiment with that. Personally, that's not something that I would do on my main accounts. I recently had a conversation on Instagram with somebody who asked me, oh, do you have a separate channel? And I'm like, no, I don't, but that's something that I would experiment just for the sake of it. But on my main channels, I don't think I would ever post any kind of AI avatar because they creep me out. And I would always want to make sure that my face is on the forefront when everything else is robotic. And a couple of ideas. I want you to think about the boldest beliefs that you think. Any kind of posts that you could write that maybe you're a little bit scared to share. Like anything that's a little bit like on edge or maybe it's going to piss people off. Instead of watering it down, make sure that you share it from the heart. Be okay with pissing people off because the thing with ChatGPT, and I'm somebody who co-creates with ChatGPT quite a bit, but I always make sure that I still write my own quotes, everything I say in video. I always want to make sure that ChatGPT has a little bit of that information on me. Yes, I'm aware of plagiarism situations that ChatGPT was caught in and all that kind of stuff. That's why you always want to make sure that you vet your content and you also rewrite a little bit of it yourself. You don't just copy it word for word, but I want you to think of any kind of beliefs or stories that you are scared to share that may be a little bit too edgy, maybe even too edgy for yourself, because ChatGPT is not always going to piss people off, in my opinion. I feel like a lot of the content it writes, unless I give it information, unless I give it instructions, it doesn't really write the content using my voice, and it doesn't push people as much as I would personally push people. So I want you to implement those three things. Just to recap, audit your content, what's yours and what sounds like mimicry, and your coach. Number two, reconnect with your origin story and positioning. And number three, start creating pattern breakers content that only you could write. And I really want you to sit with it and think back to your stories, like I said before, and do that. And then report back and let me know. Feel free to message me on Instagram and let me know how that works for you.